By early morning, officials across the Gulf were already realizing this crisis was becoming something far larger than another military exchange between the United States and Iran. Because this time, the center of the story was no longer only Iran, it was Oman. And once Oman entered the conversation, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Oil traders started watching more closely. Military analysts started discussing worst-case scenarios. And governments across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East quietly began preparing for the possibility that one of the world's most important shipping routes could suddenly become unstable again. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another waterway. It is one of the most strategically important economic choke points on Earth. Roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes through it every single day. At some points, nearly 20 million barrels of oil move through that narrow corridor within 24 hours, which means instability there does not stay regional for very long. It becomes global extremely fast. And after Donald Trump publicly warned that nobody would control the strait, while also threatening consequences involving Oman, fears surrounding a much larger geopolitical and economic crisis exploded again. The latest escalation began after renewed military activity connected to Iran, and the Strait of Hormuz region triggered another round of tensions. American officials described the operations as defensive in nature. But the situation escalated rapidly after Trump publicly rejected the idea that Iran or Oman could influence access through the waterway. Then came the line that immediately spread across political media and geopolitical networks worldwide: "We'll have to blow them up." That single sentence instantly changed the emotional tone surrounding the crisis, because Oman is not just another country sitting somewhere in the region. Oman sits directly beside the Strait of Hormuz itself, and Oman has traditionally been viewed as one of the quieter diplomatic stabilizers inside the Gulf. So once threats and military rhetoric suddenly started involving Oman directly, officials began paying attention much more seriously. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and hearing that instability around one narrow water route could suddenly affect global fuel prices, shipping costs, inflation, and international supply chains. That is essentially what governments and markets started quietly calculating after those comments, and that's the part now making military analysts nervous. Because once shipping security enters the center of a geopolitical crisis, the consequences stop feeling regional. They begin feeling worldwide. The Strait of Hormuz is not symbolic. It is economically critical. Around 1/5 of the world's petroleum consumption flows through that route. Major economies depend heavily on uninterrupted access through those waters: China, India, Japan, South Korea, large parts of Europe, and even the United States carefully monitors Hormuz because global oil instability affects international markets almost immediately. That is why the emotional atmosphere surrounding the Middle East shifted so quickly after the latest escalation. Only days earlier, much of the discussion centered around whether ceasefire negotiations could calm tensions. Now the conversation suddenly became about oil routes, shipping security, regional escalation, and fears surrounding one of the world's most important trade corridors. That is a very different level of crisis. And according to multiple reports and televised discussions following Trump's comments, analysts immediately began warning that the region may be entering a much more unstable phase than many governments expected, because the issue is no longer only military confrontation. The issue is uncertainty, and uncertainty alone can move markets dramatically. Oil traders do not wait for missiles to land before reacting. Markets react to fear. And right now, fear surrounding Hormuz is clearly rising again. At the same time, Iran continues signaling that the Strait of Hormuz remains one of its most important strategic pressure points. That matters enormously, because if both sides continue escalating publicly while military activity also continues nearby, the possibility of a much broader confrontation rises significantly, especially if shipping security itself becomes part of the conflict narrative. And this is where the situation becomes much more dangerous than many people realize, because global energy markets are still fragile. Shipping systems remain highly sensitive after years of disruptions. Inflation continues pressuring governments across the world, and energy prices remain politically explosive almost everywhere, which means even the perception of instability around Hormuz can trigger international consequences very quickly. But that was not even the biggest concern officials quietly started discussing behind the scenes. The bigger concern was what happens if multiple regional tensions begin connecting together at the same time, because the Middle East is already balancing several overlapping crises simultaneously. Iran, Israel, Lebanon, the Houthis, American military deployments, proxy groups, shipping security, oil markets, and now Oman suddenly becoming part of the escalation narrative itself. That combination creates an extremely unpredictable environment. And history shows that geopolitical crises often become most dangerous precisely when smaller tensions begin merging together into one larger confrontation. That is when governments begin losing confidence that escalation can remain controlled. And according to several regional analysts following Trump's comments, some governments in the Gulf are now quietly reassessing how stable the regional security structure really is. Because once threats begin involving countries directly connected to the Strait of Hormuz, every government in the region starts calculating economic risks alongside military risks. And that changes the entire equation. But then another concern started spreading across international discussions. What happens if instability around Hormuz lasts longer than markets expect? Because short-term panic is one thing, long-term uncertainty is something very different. And that possibility is exactly what started making global financial analysts increasingly nervous. Because once uncertainty surrounding a major global shipping route continues spreading, markets begin preparing for scenarios governments hope never actually happen. And that is where the Strait of Hormuz crisis becomes far more dangerous than many people realize. Nearly 1/3 of the world's seaborne oil trade passes through that narrow corridor. At its narrowest point, the shipping lane itself is only a few miles wide, which means even limited disruption there could rapidly affect global energy systems. And that is exactly why officials across Washington, Europe, China, and the Gulf region are watching this situation so carefully now. Because if instability around Hormuz intensifies, the consequences would move far beyond the Middle East very quickly. And behind the scenes, many analysts believe governments are already quietly preparing contingency plans for exactly that possibility, because this is no longer simply about military rhetoric. This is now about whether global trade systems themselves could begin feeling pressure from the escalation. Imagine cargo companies suddenly rerouting shipments. Imagine insurance costs for oil tankers suddenly increasing dramatically. Imagine governments preparing for fuel price spikes before winter demand rises again. Those are the kinds of calculations now quietly entering discussions behind closed doors. And that's where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because every major power views Hormuz differently. For Iran, the strait represents leverage. For Gulf countries, it represents economic survival. For China, it represents energy dependence. For the United States, it represents strategic stability. And for global markets, it represents predictability. The problem is, all four of those priorities are now colliding at the same time. That creates an extremely fragile environment. And history shows that once military escalation and economic fear begin feeding each other simultaneously, situations can spiral much faster than leaders originally expect. That is one of the biggest concerns now spreading across geopolitical circles. Not necessarily one giant dramatic event overnight, but a chain reaction of smaller escalations that gradually become impossible to contain. One side increases military pressure, another side responds rhetorically, markets react, shipping fears rise, military deployments increase, then another warning appears, then oil prices jump again. And suddenly, the crisis expands faster than diplomacy can slow it down. That pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout modern geopolitical history. And many analysts now believe the Middle East may be entering exactly that kind of escalation cycle. Especially after the combination of ceasefire instability, Hormuz fears, new military activity, regional threats, oil route concerns, and increasingly aggressive rhetoric from multiple sides. That combination is extremely dangerous, and perhaps the clearest sign that governments understand the seriousness of the situation is how aggressively diplomatic communication now appears to be increasing across the region. Because while public statements remain confrontational, Private communication often tells the real story. Military aircraft activity around the Gulf has reportedly intensified. Regional governments are increasing coordination. International monitoring systems remain highly active around shipping lanes. And analysts continue warning that repeated military exchanges near critical trade routes create dangerous conditions for miscalculation. That word matters, miscalculation, because major geopolitical crises rarely begin because leaders openly announce they want a massive global confrontation. More often, crises expand because multiple sides incorrectly assume the other side will eventually back down. Then suddenly nobody does. And once economic pressure becomes emotionally tied to military escalation, public fear accelerates even faster. That is exactly why the phrase oil panic started appearing across financial and geopolitical discussions almost immediately after the latest developments. Because oil markets are psychological as much as they are physical. Sometimes perception alone is enough to trigger instability. And right now, the perception of instability is clearly growing, especially as global audiences begin realizing how much of the world economy depends on uninterrupted movement through Hormuz. And perhaps the most dangerous part of all is how quickly the emotional atmosphere surrounding the crisis changed. Only a short time ago, many people still believed the region might slowly move toward stabilization after ceasefire discussions. Now the global conversation suddenly revolves around oil panic, shipping security, Hormuz instability, regional escalation, and fears surrounding one of the world's most important trade corridors. That shift happened incredibly fast. And once financial fears begin merging with military escalation, crises tend to become much larger very quickly. That is exactly why governments around the world are now watching the Strait of Hormuz situation so closely, because if instability there continues rising, the consequences would extend far beyond the Middle East. Fuel prices, shipping systems, inflation, global trade, military positioning, energy security. Every one of those systems becomes vulnerable if tensions around Hormuz continue escalating. And right now, many analysts believe the world may only be seeing the beginning of a much larger geopolitical confrontation unfolding underneath the surface. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to USA News Now for more breaking geopolitical stories, global crisis coverage, and high-intensity world news analysis explained in fast, easy-to-follow episodes